Hi there again, everybody, and welcome back. I hope you have refreshed yourselves, excuse me, and stretched your legs and limbs more generally. Thank you again to Professor Graham for her really thoughtful words and stimulus. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Marcela Cazzoli. Dr. Cazzoli is an associate professor in Hispanic Studies at University of Durham. Her research interests include second language acquisition and teaching, and the sociolinguistic outcomes of language contact, which is a fascinating concept. At present, she's working on a transnational approach to language teaching in higher education and on the linguistic contact between Welsh and Spanish in Argentine Patagonia. Marcela was the Durham lead for the Roots into Languages Northeast initiative and led an OWRI, which is, I think, an Other Worlds Research Initiative, I think it stands for, outreach projects on sociolinguistic awareness in secondary education, aimed at increasing students' understanding of their own language and linguistic identities to develop respect for linguistic diversity. Delighted for you to be able to join us and share your thoughts today on transnationalizing and decolonizing the modern languages curriculum. Certainly this is something that my students are very alive to and interested in, so I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and ideas. So I shall make you a co-host, and hopefully you'll be able to share your resources.
Okay, so let's see if that works. I think it does.
It does?
Yep, thank you very much. Hang on, there we go. Thank you, thanks for your introduction, and thank you for having me here today. It's a bit of a shame that we can't see each other in person, but maybe there'll be another opportunity. I started my career as a secondary school teacher, which is why I'm so interested in the links between what we do at university and what we can do at school. And I'm going to, from Suzanne's presentation, I'm going to think about and perhaps use some of the expressions that she has used. So she was talking about valuing difference and otherness, and I think it's quite important in the within the topic of decolonization. But also finding the right balance, because unfortunately, I think we have more freedom at university when talking about our curricula and our programs, but at school, the freedom is more limited. So finding a right balance between what we can do and what we are told or not told to do. So I think that was quite good timing in terms of presentations from what Suzanne has said. And I've added, as you can see in the title, I've added that not just, we're not going to talk about decolonizing the modern languages curriculum, but also transnationalizing it. And I think it's an approach that leads to decolonization. Decolonization cannot work in itself without the idea of what's the transnational behind the teaching of languages. And when we think of English and teaching of English, the transnational is already there, because there are different kinds of Englishes. There's even a European English that, you know, nobody's a native speaker of European English, but it's something that people do speak within the European Union. So it's easy to associate the transnational with the English language, but then it stops there, and we need to learn to think about the teaching we're doing in modern languages as it being transnational. Decolonizing the curriculum is a huge enterprise. It's something that sounds daunting, and sometimes it's difficult to know where to start. But I've just put this quote here so that we're all, you know, we all understand what we mean by this. So this is the examination of the power dynamics which have led to the dominance of certain languages over others, and which languages are and are not accorded resources in schools, universities, colleges, and so on and so forth. There has been a national discussion on community languages, heritage speakers, where do they fit in language teaching in the country? Some schools would provide more languages than others. Why? What's the guiding principle, you know, when choosing what languages to provide? Now, to tell you a little bit more about myself, and before we come to what I'd like to suggest for today, just to say, as Ollie was saying, I'm interested in language contact, and it's that interest in what happens when languages come into contact that has led me to do research in transnational language research, transnational language teaching, and also has led me to realize that when I examine the errors, the mistakes of students who are learning second, third, fourth languages, and I look at the aspects of the mother tongue that native speakers lose when in constant contact with another language. So think about, for example, Spanish in the US, or think about the close contact between an Aboriginal language or Spanish, for example, in countries like Paraguay. So what happens is the aspects of a language that a native speaker may lose due to what we call attrition, when two languages are in close contact permanently, are the same aspects that second language learners are finding hard to learn from a second language. This is really interesting, and it tells us a lot about the world in which these languages come into contact. So what I would like to start this presentation with is on two principles. Languages do not exist in isolation. We are used to, if your training was anything like mine, I'm originally from Latin America. I'm the child of transnational family. So my family is Italian, is composed of Italian, Spanish, French, but I was born in Buenos Aires. So we've got this mixture, right? And even though the country and many countries in Latin America speak Spanish as a standard form, a standard and the language that is taught in schools, this is by no means a language that emerged in isolation. And also we've got to remember that in spite of what we've been told to, the way in which we've been told to teach and assess, if we go into the real world, the native speaker standard is no longer crucial. So if you've got intercultural communication proficiency and you've got proficiency up to a certain extent with the language, you'll be fine. I mean, this is not something we tell our students to often because they want them to be as good as possible. But if you look at the research in modern languages, the standard, the native speaker standard, is not the ideal. So what do we mean by a transnational decolonized language education? And the work what we're doing at universities is that means that this is the kind of education that we choose to put our efforts in. So an education that challenges the one nation, one language ideology and the understanding of culture that is totally language dependent. So I teach in Hispanic studies, and I have been a language teacher for many years. I also teach on cultural modules. I put the two together. I try to put the two together as often as I can. If I'm teaching language, I'm not just teaching this is a pencil, that is a book in Spanish, but I'm trying to tell my students what it's like to be a speaker of the language, not just in Spain, not just in Latin America, but in the US, in the Philippines, in the north of Africa, for example. The interrelationship between languages. So how does Spanish and English come together? What happens? Why? How languages and cultures operate and interact across different areas of activities. So we can't isolate languages and put them in a separate silo. These languages are interacting every day with other areas of activities. Whether they're academic or not, doesn't matter. But if we've got different subjects in the school, for example, how do we relate what we're doing in Spanish, what we're doing in French, what history with what's happening in the other subjects that the students are taking? And also remember that this gives, when we focus on a language and not just where, the colonial side of it, but where it's spoken in the world, that gives the subaltern a voice. So this Spanish that I keep referring to Spanish because it's a language I teach, but this Spanish, that we're talking about in Spain is in contact with how many other languages, in Latin America with how many other languages. So minority languages, dialects, accents, hybrid and mixed language forms. So are we talking about Spanglish? Are we talking about Cocoliche, which was the Italian Spanish that emerged with immigration into Argentina? And this pushes inevitably the decolonization agenda. We are looking beyond the border. And this is what we try to achieve with decolonizing our education. Other principles. Transnational decolonized language education challenges the instrumental view of language. So are we just learning language because it's a useful skill to get a job? Or is there anything else? So a conceptualization of languages that is more open and inclusive and that looks to the world is important. We would be challenging Anglocentric and Eurocentric views in language teaching, certainly. And also, if we are teaching in a decolonized transnational way, we're promoting linguistic and cultural diversity. And this allows students to, the sky's the limit. They can, if they're doing research for a written piece, or I don't know, if you're doing a project, they're engaging in a project, they won't just be looking at where the language is typically spoken, but they would go further than that. I am very aware, because I have been a language teacher at school, that at university we have a lot of freedom, but I know that the situation in schools is different, and that you're limited by decisions that are being made elsewhere. But Suzanne was talking about tightrope walking or dancing. She was giving us hope in the sense that, well, with GCSEs, there has been a review, the decisions were made, but we have to make what we can. We have to make the best of it in any ways we can. So I know that this may sound like what I'm going to say, what I've been saying may sound like, oh, but we can't do that. We can't go further than what the syllabus is telling us to do. But I think a little bit counts. So if we think of our students, what do they need? We've got probably, you're in London, aren't you? So we're in the Northeast, which is probably the whitest, poorest region in the country. But we are having more, even in the Northeast, we're having more and more diversity in our classrooms. Are we taking advantage of that? These students we've got bilingual students, we've got multilingual students, we've got students who may not speak English at school. So are we taking advantage of this raw material that we have in the classroom that replicates what the world is really about? So our students come to school, there's a syllabus, there's a language class, an X number of hours a week, and they are kept in a bubble where the language is practiced. But then they go out and they go on the internet and they see, oh, there are hybrids everywhere, there are borrowings, you've got the terms under the second point, you've got changes in word order. We tell our students, if you're teachers of Spanish, that the subject is completely, it's not necessary, because the conjugation in the verb will tell us who we are talking about. But if we go to varieties in the Caribbean, for example, if we go to Mexico, we're going to see that the subject becomes more and more obligatory because of its contact with English. And we're telling our students that, just for them to know. In some cases, there's a loss of agreement. So gender agreement is lost because of the influence of other languages. Are we telling them about that? Of course, we want them to learn the basic rules of the language and what the curriculum is asking us to teach. But isn't it good? Wouldn't it be good for them to know that the world is using that language in a variety of ways. So let me move on. So how, that's the one. So can we, sorry, I've lost my notes here. Can we decolonize and transnationalize the language curriculum within the limitations that we're given? And I think we can. Again, at university, we have a lot more freedom, but in schools, you can try to design curricular activities that can make students appreciate the role of languages within and beyond the language classroom. So look at the community, what's happening. Maybe you're doing this already. I know I'm perhaps giving you ideas you have already put into practice, but you know, what communities, what multilingual, bilingual communities are out there? What can we learn from the way in which they interact in society? Remember, we're talking about decolonizing the curriculum, so languages that may appear to be not as important, community languages that might, you know, appear to be less important. Why are they less important? Why are they perceived in that way? Should we do something about it? And I think learners would find this extremely motivating. We can emphasize when we're teaching that we're going beyond the national standard of languages, so that minority language norms and cultural products are not excluded. So why is it that we have weird words in Latin America, for example, for objects that the Spaniards would call in a different way? Well, because, you know, there were languages before colonization, and these words have been borrowed from these Aboriginal languages. We can also facilitate debates and a curiosity for different social and cultural perspectives across languages and cultures. What do you know about these languages? What have you heard? Why? And also, which has to do with the community as well, exposing students to topics and discourses that can show a national and a transnational context. So if a language is spoken in, you know, within a national context in some place, and they're discussing a particular topic in this country, how is that discussed somewhere else where the language is also spoken? Okay. And also trying to find, and I'm sure you already do this, but trying to find materials that are based on what students find interesting, the experience that they've had, and also their aspirations. What are they planning on doing with the languages that they're learning? Are they planning to, you know, work somewhere else? Are they planning to just take a holiday? Are we motivating them enough so that they can take A levels and perhaps carry on with language study at university? Now, how can we decolonize and transnationalize the language curriculum? Again, if I look at the way I was trained to teach languages, it was very much a finished object. So the language was this, and I had to teach the grammar, the vocabulary, how to speak, how to understand. But if we have in our heads the concept of, you know, a language as a living process that does not always conform to a list of rules printed in a grammar book, that may have many different versions depending on the variety that you are speaking, and also that we will borrow from other languages that might be considered lesser languages, then and we pass this on to students, they will be motivated as well to find these words that come from other languages. And why is it that Spanish, for example, is borrowing languages when it's, you know, it's an international language? If we make students aware of the differences between the way language is taught and described in pedagogical grammars and the way it is spoken in real life by real speakers, if they can see the difference, but also if they realize that they've got to learn the basics to expand, to be able to use the language in the real world. Exemplifying how languages and dialects are used in real life social context in the real world. One of the problems that I see as a foreigner, I've been in the UK for 25 years. I came to do my postgraduate studies and then I stayed. And one of the problems that I find is that students, please tell me if you disagree with me, is that in English, students don't know. I mean, they don't know about their own language. So English speakers won't know what a verb, an adjective, subject, what a transitive verb is. But also there's, and apologies for my dog barking in the background, but also there's a very marked view on dialects, accents. Not that this doesn't happen in other places, in other countries, but I think as a linguist that if students knew a little bit more about the languages that they are native speakers of, they would be more open to understanding what happens with the languages that they're teaching, that they're learning in school. So perhaps talking about dialects, talking about accents, which can be easily represented in the classroom because you have, you'll have pupils from, from different backgrounds, and then trying to make the analogy between that and what happens with the particular language that you're teaching. This could be really useful. And something that you might say, well, yeah, you might say, well, I'm not sure we can do this, but error correction is something that has been discussed as, and this is also in teaching training, that has been discussed as hindering what students might be capable of because it just inhibits them. So if they get corrected all the time, and if we are comparing what they are saying with the native speaker standard, and we keep doing that, then that will motivate the student to learn more. So I'm not saying that you can, as language teachers, stop correcting mistakes, but if we change the way in which, if you change our attitude, if we talk about accents and dialects in the languages that we're teaching, and that variation is not a sign of imperfection. So the way my Spanish, Argentinian Spanish, is generally mocked because we use a different pronoun, because we sound very Italian. And so, at some point in my career, when I was starting in this country, I was asked to change my accent to match the Spanish variety so that my students wouldn't get confused. Nobody would ask me to do that now. But then there was an attitude there, and an attitude that said, what you are saying, what you're speaking is not quite right, is it? And if I'm not saying that we have this attitude these days, but if we change our attitude towards errors, then that might also help students feel more at ease in the classroom, and it'll give them the opportunity to understand what other varieties and dialects and accents that are in the languages that you're teaching and that they're learning. So what shall we do? When I spoke about this at a conference, somebody stood up and said, oh yeah, but students need to know the language well. They need to understand the rules of the academy. Of course they do. They need to pass an exam, right? So they need to speak and write according to the rules of the academy. But even though the syllabus may not, according to the latest revisions to GCSEs, there may not be a lot about culture, they need an intercultural speaker's competence. So they need to be aware of the variety and this sensitive to cross-cultural communication. What kinds of things can I say in my language that I cannot say in the language that I'm learning, or that I need to be careful about? If we also point out where and in what situations people speak, read and write the target language, that might differ from the target language being used on the internet, or in transnational migration contexts, or by companies, markets, the media, in international culture cooperation. How do foreigners use the language that I'm teaching? And why is that okay in the context of the world? It may not be okay for the exam I have to pass, because I need the mark to go to uni or to get a job, but it is perfectly okay out there in the real world. It's common sense, but from my experience, I don't think we do it this often. We don't often discuss with our students how the language is used in the real world, and where and in what situations. And I have to refer to Spanish in this because is what I know. But for example, a few years ago, we were teaching Spanish at university, at least in my university. We were teaching, we're a school of modern languages and cultures. We've got 8 languages being taught in the school. And a lot of us were seeing that we were teaching languages in silos without connecting French and Spanish and Italian and Arabic and Chinese and Japanese and German. And we were not looking at the past. We were not looking at the future of this language. And when I'm talking about language classes, I'm not talking about the cultural modules. So if we could talk to our students about the historical contributions from languages, in the case of Spanish, from Arabic, French, Basque, Catalan, the heavy influence by English, the contact with Aboriginal languages and immigrant languages as well, that these languages go through processes where there's lexical borrowing, code switching, and I've put into brackets Kim Reggiano. Kim Reggiano, you'll probably guess this, but it's those of you who teach Spanish, but is the mixture of Welsh and Spanish in Patagonia. So there's a small community, immigrant community from late 19th century, which is what I've been collecting data on. Mixing Spanglish and Portuñol, for example, Spanish and Portuguese in Latin America, that has hybrids, that is part of a mixed language. In Spanish, we get media lengua in Ecuador. That there are pidgins and creoles using this language. And at more advanced levels, as you go towards A levels, telling them that the language that you are teaching has also been subjected to influence from English in particular, but from other languages as well. So the subjunctive might be used less in some languages because of the influence of English or other languages. Expressions that don't make sense have been translated. I mean, don't make sense in the language that's borrowing them, are being used. So if we let them work with materials that are from the real world, rather than from the language book, the handbook that we're using with them, that might also be quite motivating and might give them the idea that languages, are more open and inclusive than what we think. To sum up, because I don't want to carry on with this for too long, how can we decolonize and transnationalize language teaching? By reorienting language teaching to address transnationality, so languages do not develop in isolation, and monolingualism is not the norm. And this is something they might not know about. By shifting away from autonomous structure and towards a recognition of a global understanding of language use. Languages don't exist in silos, in separate entities. by helping them acquire competencies in the language in question. So we're not talking about one competence, but different competencies depending on the context that they're talking about. So, and this can provide them to an opportunity to become world citizens with a more cosmopolitan outlook of language use. By changing our own attitudes to variation and error correction. Variation does not equal imperfection, and the standard does not always meet all communicative needs. By allowing students to challenge themselves, their thinking and cultural assumptions, why do I think that the Spanish in Spain should be the standard? Why is it that a particular variety is mocked? What have I heard about this? And also, and I think this is very important, by capitalizing on the diversity already present in the classroom. So if you have heritage speakers, bilingual, multilingual students, make a point of using their resources so that they can explain in perhaps different languages that your students might be also studying at school, the meaning of a concept, for example. And I'll stop here because I want to bore you too much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cazzoli, for your thoughts.